This episode is brought to you by Shopify. Forget the frustration of picking commerce platforms when you switch your business to Shopify, the global commerce platform that supercharges your selling wherever you sell. With Shopify, you'll harness the same intuitive features, trusted apps, and powerful analytics used by the world's leading brands. Sign up today for your $1 per month trial period at shopify.com/tech, all lowercase. That's shopify.com/tech.
Atheists, agnostics, long-haired weirdos, short-haired weirdos, vandals, hooligans.
The government, hug the government, love the government, hug the government, love the government, hug the government, love.
Welcome to The Politics Guys, a place for bipartisan, rational, and civil debate on American politics and policy. I'm Trey Orndorff, a political scientist at Oklahoma Christian University. And I am joined, not just today, but for the next 3 weeks, that's right, by Ken Katkin, a professor of law at Chase Law School. Ken, we're going to stop saying welcome to the show because it's just going to be us for a while.
Yeah, we're going to be the Iron Men of the politics guys.
Yeah, see, I like that because, as listeners know, last week, Mike was letting everybody know he and his wife are off taking a look and they're trying to become expats, right? They're trying to move overseas. And that got me to thinking about this, Ken, and I think this is important. And that is, right, I mean, we have Mike. I mean, how is he going to really be a patriot if he doesn't live in the United States, right? So I don't know.
Well, absence can make the heart grow fonder.
So maybe they'll get out there and they're going to be like France, whatever. They're going to come back to the United States, And then, Jay, he's supposed to be the big patriot, but I don't know. I mean, sometimes he supports some positions, and I feel like we
are the Iron Men.
We are the Iron Men, right? Yep. We are the true American patriots of the politics guys.
We are the tent poles around which this show is going to stand for a while.
Well, in seriousness, though, for listeners, Ken and I are going to be taking this on both the main shows and the bonus shows for the next 3 weeks, which I'm really excited about. So I thought we kind of get started with, this is an earlier court ruling, Ken, this week. But what I thought we get started with is a federal judge in Louisiana actually barred the White House from interfering with social media companies' behavior. Now, it's a big opinion. It's 155 pages. So I'm going to admit I didn't read every single word perfectly, but I got through most of it. And so here's what the facts kind of seem to be. And I think this is going to end up being a pretty big case as it moves forward. Facebook and Twitter, it appears, and this is kind of the undisputed part of the decision, not only worked with the White House, but they gave them high-level tools to allow them to kind of look at, target, and flag information. Now, I want to be clear here because this has come up a few times in different kind of contexts. If you take a look at this opinion, a lot of the people who are making the complaint here have wacky beliefs, right? I mean, that's just the way that it is. I don't agree with them all. One of the individuals in the lawsuit, a company called Gateway Pundits, is it's kind of a whack job news outlet, but that's kind of really beside the point here for this case because it's really about, what can or can't come forward. So what's happened is that Twitter, for example, allowed the White House to even go beyond this kind of, you might call it crackpot stuff, to take down things like parody accounts. Now, why this is all really kind of controversial, according to the federal judge, which is true, is that none of the issues that are going on here actually violate the terms of service. So, for example, the parody account that got taken down isn't a violation of the terms of service. It was just something the White House wanted them to do. When it came to medical commentary, Facebook explicitly deprioritized some content, even though that it didn't violate its own rules if the White House asked them to so do. Not only this, but it actually had in-person meetings with these companies where it required what they called, quote, single points of access so that that is, again, the White House, could flag information. Now, we've kind of talked about this a little bit on one front, Ken, and that is, we've often argued that individuals don't have free speech rights on social media. And what we mean by that is to say, right, it's a private company. They have the ability to say what is or does not relate to their rules. The problem here, as I'm reading it, I'm curious what your take on is, it seems to be, is, okay, we have a bunch of things that didn't violate their rules, But then you have government officials stepping in and saying, hey, it'd be really nice if you take this down, or hey, this is damaging to, this parody account is damaging to us. Can you take that down? So in other words, are they effectively circumventing First Amendment rights by stepping into the private sphere and saying, hey, could you do us some favors? And the federal judge in this case is saying, yeah, you can't do that. And that's why we get this injunction. So what do you think about this, Ken?
Well, you won't be surprised that I think it's another corrupt ruling that has no basis in law from another corrupt Trump judge. And I think it follows a pattern that you see in a lot of these corrupt rulings, both in the recent Supreme Court and in lower court rulings, where they will express legal principles that everyone should agree with, that are correct, right? I mean, the principle that we don't have a ministry of truth, the principle that the government can't suppress speech just because it has weird ideas. These are all valid, correct principles, and a lot of the recent corrupt opinions like this one will express valid, corrupt principles like that as their major premise, and then they'll just completely distort and mislead about the facts in a way that bear no relation to reality, and then they'll conclude that the Biden administration has violated those kind of principles when it completely obviously hasn't. And in this case, the parts that the court leaves out are that Facebook and the other social media sites, not. Well, I guess it was Twitter then. Yeah, I mean, it changed when Elon Musk came in. But these sites welcomed and wanted this kind of engagement. That they weren't being censored. They were, they had realized that their platforms had been used to foment the January 6th insurrection, and that their platforms had been used to disseminate a lot of harmful, misleading information about vaccines that was causing a lot of deaths. And don't forget, 7 million people have died of COVID in the world, not all in the United States.
So why not just change your terms of service then to make to kind of outlaw those kinds of things in your principle? That seemingly would have potentially fixed this issue, right? I mean, because the piece of the facts, and I'm curious about how that fits into your argument here, is, hey, had this been in the terms of service, woohoo, move forward. But because it's not in the terms of service, then you're now targeting individuals, and you're kind of you're violating the contract, saying this is allowed, but we're not going to allow it.
No, there's no contract like that. It's a complete.
Well, you have a user agreement. That's a contract.
The user agreement doesn't give anybody a right to have any content on these platforms, and even if it did, it wouldn't be enforceable because nobody has paid any consideration for that. These are all free accounts, which would make it an unenforceable contract if it were a contract. So there's no contract between the users and Facebook, and under both the First Amendment and under Section 230 of the Communications Decency Act, which is relevant but misused in this opinion, the very reason that social media platforms have immunity from liability for content that's posted by third parties is to enable those social media platforms to act as what's sometimes called good Samaritans, and to just take down content that they think is harmful. That's the purpose of giving them the immunity. If they didn't have that immunity, they would run a risk of liability if they took down somebody's content. But they were given that immunity on the express quid pro quo. Well, social media companies and any kind of company that hosts third-party content on the internet, because this statute is older than social media, but even just like World Wide Web platforms, they have immunity from liability for third-party content to enable them to have the ability to take down third-party content that they consider harmful without having liability. So they don't owe anybody any right to have anything on their platform. I think, like, if you take the logic of this argument seriously, I'll give you an analogy that I think will expose how vacuous it is. So, I am a state government employee. I teach at a state university. I'm a law professor at Northern Kentucky University. And very frequently, the student editors of our Northern Kentucky Law Review will have articles submitted to them for publication. And they'll come to me and they'll say, would you mind reading this article? Somebody submitted it. We don't know if it's legit or not. We don't know if it should be published or not. And I'll read it. And sometimes I'll say, no, this is not a legit article. I recommend that you don't publish it. And then sometimes they don't publish it. Now, according to this judge's opinion, Judge Doherty's opinion, I've just violated the First Amendment by doing that, just by offering an opinion to the student editors of the Law Review that I don't think something that was submitted is worth publishing.
Aren't there two slight differences to your analogy? I mean, of course, in the one case, you're not a government agency, you yourself, right?
Sure, I am. I'm a state actor. I absolutely am. I don't know how you could say I'm not. I mean, the only capacity that they're asking me my opinion is that I'm a professor at the state university. It's in my official capacity as a professor. Right.
I mean, they are asking you in your kind of bureaucratic expertise judgment whether or not something...
They recognize that because I'm their professor. It's because I'm a state actor. It's not independent of that.
I'm not sure. I mean, I'm not sure you would classify the White House as an expert. I guess it's not the state actor that I'm having issue with there potentially, but it's the expertise. I'm sorry. Continue. Yeah.
No, they are experts. I mean, think about this. This was about vaccine disinformation, and the White House is saying
that was one piece of it.
Well, let's start with that piece of it. We can get to the other pieces of it. But on that piece, it fits the paradigm perfectly, right? You've got a lot of misinformation that's going to get people killed. You've got Facebook and the old Twitter pre-Elon Musk saying, we don't want our platforms used to disseminate vaccine disinformation and get people killed. We want to have some input from the best experts about the best medical advice here. And actually, the U.S. government is the best experts. Dr. Anthony Fauci and his staff at HHS, they are the best experts. And so they're giving their opinions to Facebook, which wants those opinions. And Facebook is using that to figure out ways to reduce the dissemination of harmful misinformation that's going to get people killed. And there's no compulsion there. I mean, another way to think about this, if you want to put it in a First Amendment framework, is that it's commonly said that, we shouldn't have censorship, but that the best remedy for noxious speech is good counter speech. And that's exactly what happened here, right? That the experts and the officials at the government are persuading Facebook or Twitter, you don't want to be the publisher who publishes this harmful disinformation that's going to get people killed, and let us explain to you why this is harmful disinformation that'll get people killed. And then they come around to agree, okay, you've given us good explanations, and now we don't want to publish that. It's just like any publisher deciding that they don't want to publish something because it's not something they want to be associated with.
Now, I don't disagree that Facebook and Twitter have every right to say what gets to be on or not on their platform. However, I do think that where you might start to, I think your analogy begins to break down, is where you start moving away from the COVID piece of the ruling and you start looking at it as that larger whole, which includes several examples where it's clearly an ideological underpinning. So, for example, this particular parody account is damaging to us, in the words of the White House, and it needs to come down. Well, that's not an expert, state actor saying, hey, this is going to get somebody killed. This is somebody saying, hey, this is potentially damaging to us in the White House. Can you do us a favor and change your rules just for this particular case? I mean, you can continue to make fun of other people, but just don't do it as it surrounds the Bidens in this particular case.
Well, you're talking about someone who was, harassing Joe Biden's granddaughter, who is, I believe, a minor, and who's had some problems, that people are being very mean to her about. And
I'm not saying it's a good thing, and I'm not. But
that's it. I mean, it might not be that, it's not that someone could be punished by law for publishing that kind of content, but Facebook has to make the decision whether they want to publish that kind of content. And I mean, the fact that it was brought to their attention, and you just said it's not a good thing. Why can't Facebook say it's not a good thing and we don't want to publish it?
I would happily say that if they were to make that. In other words, if I could do the same thing, if you had a rule that said, look, you can't have parody accounts about minors, or we're not going to allow you to have parody accounts, I think that would be something useful as well, so that any particular individual could get the same kind of access and say, hey, look, here's somebody violating your terms of service. You need to take this down.
It doesn't matter what the term. It just doesn't matter what the terms of service.
No, I'm saying is, but to say to do the same thing for everyone, right? You're not doing the same.
Why should they? They don't have to. They have their own First Amendment rights. They have their own rights under Section 230. They are deemed to be a publisher. They can decide what they want to publish and what they don't want to publish. They're not a common carrier. They don't have to treat everybody the same. That's one of the huge errors of law.
You can happily do that. I mean, again, you can happily do that, but that would then, I think, if every social media company did that and explicitly did that only for Democrats or for Democratic presidential candidates, I mean, you're perfectly free to do that. But wouldn't that exactly be the traditional conservative argument that social media companies and publishing companies care more about Democrats than they do Republicans?
So
I'm not even a Republican.
Yeah, they're allowed to. I mean, you have Parler and you have Truth Social. You have these other social media networks that care more about conservatives. They can do that. These platforms can decide what they want to publish and what they don't want to publish. And there's absolutely no legal bar to that. And there's no legal bar to the White House trying to persuade them not to publish certain things, or to anyone else who's not the White House trying to persuade them not to publish certain things. And there's no obligation whatsoever that they be consistent or that they treat everybody fairly. That's not what the media has to do under the First Amendment. And Facebook is considered to be the media under the First Amendment. Twitter is considered to be the media under the First Amendment. They can decide what they want to publish, what they don't want to publish, and they have no legal obligation to be even-handed.
So what do you think happens next?
I don't know, because you got a lot of corrupt judges in the 11th Circuit, or I guess this would be the 5th Circuit. It's in Louisiana.
I was going to say
you've got even more corrupt judges in the 5th Circuit, and you got a corrupt Supreme Court. So I don't know where this is headed. Now, I hope that the Supreme Court, you do have a few Supreme Court justices who, so far have sided with social media companies in all the Section 230 cases. So we'll see if they, stick with the doctrines that they have laid down, or if they go full on partisan like this judge did. But it seems like he's basically saying it's illegal for Facebook or Twitter to skew Democratic, and that is just completely false. Is it illegal for the National Review?
It could still be false, but his ultimate outcome is not anything to do with an injunction on the part of the social media companies. It's an injunction that the White House cannot pressure social media. That was technically the injunction.
Yeah, that is right. It's technically an injunction against them, but really it means they can't communicate with them, and that's just outrageous. In fact, it ignores a huge line of cases which mainly have been advocated by Republican justices, although there's been some bipartisan support for them. But there's this whole line of First Amendment doctrine called government speech cases, where the government is allowed to engage in speech and to try to influence debates that way. And, probably the most leading case in that line comes from the 90s, but it's a case called Rust versus Sullivan. And it has to do with doctors who wanted to treat patients where the payments were coming from Medicaid. So there was government funding for the patients. And the government had said, well, as a condition of getting this money and treating patients, doctors who take that money can't ever mention abortion to any patients. And this was back during the time when abortion was still a constitutional right. And there were challenges that said that violates the doctor's First Amendment rights, that violates the patient's First Amendment rights, that also violates rights to abortion, which were then considered constitutional rights. But conservative majority in that case said, well, the government's allowed to engage in speech, with its own voice. And if the government wants people delivering government services, not to mention abortion, that's just the government's speech. And, again, here it's even more clearly the government's speech because, unlike in Russ versus Sullivan, where they were even roping in the private doctors who took payments from the government and characterizing them as the government, here, the only speech that's being complained about here is speech that's actually from full-time government officials. And they have a right to have their administration has a right to have positions and to express them. That's all they've done is express them. And they clearly haven't coerced anybody. They haven't, that's why you still have networks like Parler and Truth Social and, all these kind of networks that would carry all this garbage. Nobody's pressuring them not to, but it's just that Facebook and Twitter didn't want to carry this stuff and they wanted help knowing what not to carry.
Well, I mean, I think what we should probably do is to talk about another potentially corrupt Supreme Court case.
Okay.
Now, we don't often do this. I set it up that way because a lot of people on Discord, which is what it heads up. Remember, if you are a supporter of the show, Discord's one of the access you get to. And a lot of people were very curious about what our takes would have been on, I think, one of the biggest takes that Mike and our newest politics guy, May, was talking about. And that was the case of Students for Fair Admission versus Harvard. And of course, this week, there's some additional add-ons to that, Ken, right? So we had the NAACP now challenging legacy admission. So I kind of want to wrap all of this up, in kind of a package for everybody. So again, we don't do this frequently, but we thought it'd be really kind of important to take this case on with this new angle, at least slightly again, in light of what Mike and May did. So to understand all of this, let me kind of re-sum things up. Last week, the Supreme Court in Students for Fair Admission versus Harvard ended up deciding that you can't use race as a factor in admissions. Now, this led to the show last week. That's actually what they launched with. And I'm going to kind of go through that. Ken and I listened through. I generally listen to the other hosts as well. But I took some notes so that we can kind of get everybody back up to speed. And May and Mike, actually, this was one of the few things last week that they kind of seemingly agreed a lot together on. One of the things they agreed on was that racial discrimination is a part of affirmative action and therefore should come under strict scrutiny. The pair also argued that the facts were not for the minority of the court. In other words, Mike actually said that he agreed with the majority's reasoning. Mike and May also agreed that while everyone agrees diversity in the classroom is important, but the problem is that their outcomes are vague. In other words, when does that end? May specifically argued that the disparity of admission, that's a 10% probability for a white student versus a 98% for a black student with identical scores at Harvard, and a 9 times more likely for a black student than for an Asian student with identical scores to get into Harvard, is problematic if there is not a measurable, quantifiable, when does that end goal in place. She would go on to argue that there needs to be a logical endpoint for affirmative action because it is a short-term remedy to past discrimination, even though it itself is a form of discrimination. In other words, both of them agreed that affirmative action is kind of a temporary violation of the Constitution, and it has to have some measurable end and fall under strict scrutiny. Now, that's what they got to, Ken. Now, of course, this week we had the NAACP's response to this. But before we get to that, I just want to pause for a second and say, what do you think about the case? And what was your take on Mike and May's position on the case?
Yeah, thanks for summarizing their position, too. So, I don't disagree with them as a policy matter. I think I have a lot of the same concerns about the way affirmative action is used that they have. However, the case is plainly wrong as a legal matter. I don't have any qualm at all with states like California and Michigan that have decided to end affirmative action. I think that might be a good idea. But to say that it's unconstitutional is so odd, because think about this. Within a couple days, the Supreme Court not only did they decide the Harvard case, but they also decided a different case called 303 Creative versus Elanus, about a web designer who hypothetically didn't want to have to design websites for same-sex marriages. And if you look at those two cases together, the Supreme Court says in the Harvard case, Harvard is not allowed to give a preference to a group of applicants based on aspects of their identity. But then in the Creative 303 case, they say, but a web designer is allowed to discriminate against a group of customers based on their identity. And I think there's literally no way to square those two holdings unless you just think the principle is that, white male cisgender people can never be discriminated against, but other groups can. And I just, keep coming back to that as evidence of the corruption. Like, if there was any coherent First Amendment theory here or 14th Amendment theory, then both the two cases should have come out the same way as each other. They both should have, either the institutions should have to comply with law in both cases, or the institutions should have a constitutional right to ignore the law in both cases. But I just don't see how there's a constitutional right of someone who wants to discriminate against one minority group to do so, but no right of someone who wants to discriminate in favor of a minority group. So I think that's really where the corruption is exposed the most. And I think there's no valid legal theory that gets you to the result that the court got to, even though I think it sounds like Mike and May were mainly talking about policy. And I think on policy, I might be on their side. But on law, I think that's up to the state legislatures or to the state constitutions or to the Board of Regents of the institutions, and if they've been authorized to make these decisions. And there's nothing in the U.S. Constitution that really addresses these issues.
So you don't think the Equal Protection Clause? So I mean, and to be clear here, I had not prepped or read a bunch on the Colorado case, right? Yeah. And so I'm at a slight disadvantage there. So I'm not going to push.
No, So again, the Equal Protection Clause, and we've talked about it before, and let's plug our bonus shows too. We're going to get to it in the bonus shows when we get to the 14th Amendment. No, I think that the correct understanding of the Equal Protection Clause, which was the one that the Supreme Court fully articulated back in 1941 in a case called Caroline Products, where there's a footnote 4 in Caroline Products that explains the meaning of the Equal Protection Clause. And it's not an obscure footnote. It's the most cited footnote in the history of constitutional law. It's been cited tens of thousands of times. And it says that the concept of the Equal Protection Clause is that it's a protection against the tyranny of the majority, and that the majority is not allowed to use its majoritarian strength in our democracy to beat up on discrete and insular minorities just because it has the numerical power to do so. That bias and animus and prejudice against minorities, against discrete and insular minorities, can't be codified into law. Legal disabilities can't be imposed on those minority groups when they just don't have the ability to protect themselves in a system of majority rule. So it's definitely a one-way ratchet. And the conservative justices have been trying to back away from that for decades. And some of the conservative justices, particularly Justice Thomas, since the early 90s, have been advocating for more of a colorblind constitution. But that, hasn't been the rule. It still isn't the rule. Even in this case, they made exceptions for the military academies, and they said that the military academies can continue to use race-conscious admissions, because otherwise we're going to wind up with an all-white officer corps and a all-minority, mostly minority enlisted corps, and it's going to lead to dysfunction in the military. Now, for them to even take account of that kind of policy consideration implies they still haven't gone to a colorblind rule. They're just doing their own policy judgments, and it's really not their place to do that.
So, I mean, here's one of the things, as you mentioned, the footnote. I mean, of course, we have the 2004 case as well. One of the issues that I think we see in the modern, I should say, contemporary United States, the contemporary America, is we have now, I believe, an overly simplistic idea of you're talking about the ratchet only goes one way, and there's truth to that, right? It's difficult to be in the majority group and be the one against whom you are being discriminated, I think, in a meaningful way. But I think that view has conceals the fact that there isn't just a singular monolithic minority group that is treated equally or similarly to the other groups. And therefore, especially in the United States, where today, I mean, the white people are one of the slowest growing. We're going to be minority soon. I don't mean minority in the sense of historic discrimination, but I mean just numeric. And I think that's where here in this case where you're talking about, well, within disparaged groups, you have this wide difference of preference. I think that could, in fact, be an equal protection clause issue, especially in the case of Harvard, where you're getting government money. So, I mean, again, I won't go all the way over to the cake in this moment, but it is a little hard to swallow to say, okay, so, and I recognize this is one of those areas where those on the left have pushed back, but you have a number of other groups, and they're not the only one, although it's one of the major ones mentioned in this case, who are also seemingly getting weird outcomes because of the way that we have rank ordered race among our minority groups. And that seems counter to even your understanding there of the equal protection clause. And so I'm curious about what you say on that. I mean, so again, if we just had a monolithic group, the oppressed, if you want to put it that way, mm-hmm. and then you had whites, okay, yeah, it ratchets it one direction. But what about internal for those groups? And that's part of this case. I mean, that's a big part of this case.
It's a big part. It's a powerful argument, and I think it's not as ridiculous as the other arguments. But so the argument you're talking about here is that when you have these colleges, in this case Harvard and North Carolina, and they want to give some preferences to African Americans, and in so doing, the actual program that they've enacted seems to those preferences are the impact of that. It burdens Asian Americans more than it burdens white people. Yeah. So,
let me give you a specific example, even from my own. When I went to Northern Kentucky University, that was some of the beginning of my interaction with this. And I worked in student government, and we were actually supposed to we had to nominate individuals to be on university committees. And there were particular ones needed to have a person who was diverse, right? And I'll never forget, this is the first time I really kind of interacted with this. We had a really good individual. He was from Nigeria. We nominated him to the committee, put him on the committee. And the dean, oh my gosh, I have never seen anybody so angry about anything. And he came down, he's like, this is a diversity position. This guy's not black, he's African.
Yeah, well, see, on policy grounds, I share exactly your frustration, and I guess Michael's and May's as well. I'm not actually in favor of that kind of affirmative action. I'm against it. But what I think is just that the Supreme Court has arrogated to itself wrongly the idea that it gets to advance its policy views rather than appropriately deferring to the.
But is that a policy view, or is that? That's part of the equal protection clause. It seems like to me, even that understanding that you had outlined. That's what I was.
Yeah, well, let's get back to the Asian Americans, because I think that's where it actually comes up in the case. So Asian Americans, they note that because of the maybe the things that are valued in the admissions process, which are sort of reverse engineered perhaps to pick up on a few more, there's maybe an overvalue being placed on some characteristics that some African Americans might have, and then that is disadvantaging Asians even more than it's disadvantaging whites. So that maybe they're de-emphasizing grades and test scores a little bit, and Asian Americans are especially excelling at grades and test scores, or they're de-emphasizing classical music instrument a little bit, and Asian Americans are therefore more disadvantaged even than whites by not getting more credit for that. So that's kind of the argument. Now, I would say this on my theory of the Constitution. If the evidence would bear out that there's been a kind of systematic discrimination against Asian Americans as a group, more than just the general burden that's placed on everybody who's not a beneficiary of the affirmative action. So if Asians really are systematically being burdened more than whites, I think that's a valid claim. But I don't think the court actually went into the evidence enough for that. I think they just really rested a lot on the idea that race is obviously counting for a lot for African American candidates, and they kind of noted that Asian American candidates are disproportionately burdened. But that could be because of other things, right? It could be because you still have these alumni preferences, and I know we're going to talk about that. But white people are highly disproportionately going to benefit from alumni preferences compared to both African Americans and Asian Americans. You have the fact that most of these selective schools are trying to field football teams and basketball teams and whatever, and athlete recruiting probably will just as a social fact is benefiting whites and blacks more than it's benefiting Asian Americans by and large for the sports that they're recruiting for. So there may be explanations for this that could refute the idea that the numerical disparity is because of discrimination. But actually, I will acknowledge that I think there was some evidence in there that the numerical disparity for Asian Americans did in fact reflect actual discrimination. And I thought that the strongest evidence of that I saw in the opinion was that you have these alumni interviewers who interview all the candidates and give them scores. And then later you have the admissions office at the university who give kind of, personality scores to all the applicants, separate and apart from their, academic scores and athletic scores and this and that. And for Asian Americans, there was a somewhat big disparity where the alumni interviewers were giving them very high ratings, and then the admissions office was downgrading them. And I actually do see that as bona fide evidence of actual discrimination against Asian Americans. And I think if the court had, had a more thorough discussion of that evidence, of whether there's countervailing evidence, of whether there's an explanation for why those scores are being downgraded more for Asian Americans than for others, I think that's a legitimate ground of inquiry. And I think if Asian Americans in fact are being discriminated against relative to whites or relative to all candidates, I think that would violate the Equal Protection Clause. But I just think that's not, the court just was oversimplistic because it just said, well, they're giving a preference to African American candidates. But I think that itself is just not unconstitutional.
Okay. I'm going to pause this there for just a minute. And when we come back, Ken, let's take on what the NAACP's response to this has been, since we've been kind of skirting on that for a minute. So, Ken, let's take the other item of this, and this is what's new for this week. This isn't something that Mike and May had the chance to get through, and that is that the NAACP, and I'll say I think rightfully, called for the end of legacy admission for schools that are already receiving financial aid dollars. Now, many schools have already done that, but there are still some holdouts. Harvard is one of them. And it was their statement about this was, I thought, telling. They effectively said, look, we already did a lot for diversity. We took a case all the way to the Supreme Court in favor of diversity. And even though we lost that case, we're going to continue to care about diversity. But ending legacy admission is just simply not on the table. And from my point of view, Ken, I think we might. I'm curious if we agree on this or not. I'm not sure. I think oftentimes race is a proxy for economic conditions. And I think here we have one of those potentially showing. Major schools that are all for affirmative action in one sense are not as quick to want to do it when it has to do with economic leveling. But of course, it isn't easy because you have all of these legacies with deep pocketbooks, and we recognize the politics that go into that. But given the court's ruling, it would seem hard to see how one would uphold legacy. But obviously, it looks like Harvard might be on the other side of the case this time, battling the opposite direction. What's your take on the NAACP's response, the suit that they filed, and what do you think about that and its likelihood?
So I'll try to answer that on three levels because your comments that went to more than just that. But
I'm sorry. I didn't mean to. I gave you a lot to chew on. I reckon.
So on the lawsuit, I think the idea is that it's illegal for a university to have a admissions process that discriminates against minorities. And so in the past, clearly these schools that had affirmative action admissions for minorities were not discriminating against minorities, and they were able to both give alumni preferences to mostly white applicants because
almost solely given
white.
One thing to keep in mind, it's almost kind of like voting in that sense, right? The grandfathering clause of it all. If you could have been in Harvard from the period of time, then you're going to be white, right?
Probably.
If you could have voted, you were white, right? So.
By and large, I mean, the clock is rolling forward some, and
for sure, yeah.
So now we're talking about alumni kids where the alums were maybe in the 1990s, and the 1990s these schools were not all white, but they were still probably a little bit disproportionately white. If you're dialing it back to the 1950s and 60s, then these schools were all white. But yeah, so I think the alumni preference in general is certainly going to give some kind of skew towards white people, and so until now. The college admissions processes could easily push back on that impact by just also giving preferences to minorities. So if you give preferences to both minorities and alumni kids, the way they were doing it until now, the preference for minorities is going to keep minorities certainly at a proportional level of representation and not at a level where they're being discriminated against by the alumni preference. But now that there's not going to be preference for minorities anymore, the argument that the NAACP is making is that using alumni preferences will have a racially disparate impact. Now, in terms of the merits of that argument, it does have to be proved, and I think that it isn't as obvious as it might sound that that's factually correct because, again, you are talking about the 1990s now, and pretty soon, like even the early 2000s, where it's those classes whose kids are coming in, and affirmative action was already pretty heavily used by that time. So it may not be that those classes are so disproportionately white that the alumni preference will skew the racial composition of the class. If it doesn't, if that fact can't be proved, then this suit is a non-starter.
Gotcha.
Right? So there's no legal obligation to have any kind of merit system. The legal obligation is just to not discriminate against minorities, and that comes from Title VI of the Civil Rights Act of 1964. So I think the NAACP is going to have to prove out some facts against some particular institutions about who the alumni were in the years that are relevant now, in the years where current applicants are kids of those alumni. But if they can prove it out, I think they'll have a case of some sort. And I don't know that the remedy would mean that there can't be an alumni preference anymore, but it would mean that they'd have to figure out some way to the schools might even be able to make lemonade out of lemon there and say, well, since our alumni preference is having a disproportionate impact on minority applicants, we need to compensate for that by admitting more minority applicants, and that could be a backdoor.
That could be the back door. Yeah, that's true.
Yeah. So it's just like I think you could analogize that to right now today. K through 12 schools are not allowed to take account of race when they assign students to which school they go to, but for many years after Brown versus Board of Ed, they did have to because they were under desegregation plans, right? So I think this could be more like that a Harvard or North Carolina could say, well, we have to be under some kind of court-ordered plan now to get our minority enrollment back up because our alumni preferences are having a disparate impact on it. So maybe it would go that way. I mean, I don't know. I don't see any legal basis for saying that alumni preferences would be illegal otherwise. I think the only legal basis for saying they would be illegal would be to say that there's evidence that they're disproportionately impacting minority applicants.
And it's true. You want to almost have that knee-jerk reaction to say, well, it would have to be. But of course, part of that's probably a little bit of time loss in the sense that I think sometimes it's hard when you're thinking about the timeline for when individuals are going to be in school. You're right. I mean, you're talking about late 1990s. Those are the parents now.
Yeah.
And that's a different era. Even working in higher education, I have to keep reminding myself of that push. As those ages get older.
Yeah, I think that's an
excellent point.
The other thing you mentioned that doesn't go to the lawsuit, but just generally, alumni preferences. I think there's good reasons for them. Although I'll also say my own kids didn't want to use them. So, I went to Princeton. Princeton is one of the schools that probably most heavily uses alumni preferences. I myself was not an alumni kid, but my kids are alumni kids.
Right.
And when I went there, and again, it was like only 1/3 as hard to get into when I went there as it is now. So, now it's gotten much harder for anyone to get into. But when I went there, I felt like I benefited a lot from the alumni preferences, even though I wasn't an alumni kid, because for one thing, a lot of my classmates had a lot of institutional knowledge about the place, which enriched my experience. And also, a lot of the classmates, had parents that gave a lot of money. And I certainly benefited from that as well, both in the sense of financial aid that I got and in the sense of just what kind of resources were available to me. So I didn't have a big problem with it as someone who got into Princeton without an alumni preference. It didn't bother me that other kids had alumni preferences. Now, when my own kids were applying to college, they wouldn't apply there. And they actually said, they said the reason they wouldn't apply there is they didn't want to have to wonder whether they only got in because of an alumni preference. So, for them, they saw it as just a negative that would kind of undermine them. But that, so I had a very opposite perspective on that from my kids. But I think the schools do get a lot of benefit from having families that have long-term association with them, having families that'll be long-term donors, and having an institutional culture where some people come in, with a lot more knowledge of the tradition. So I never had a problem with it. But I think, I know a lot of people do have a problem with it. I also think a lot of people have a very artificial idea of what a merit system would look like.
Well, that is very true.
Yeah.
That is very true.
I mean, what would a merit system look like? I think in Princeton these days, and it did get a lot harder to get in than when I went there, but, the number of valedictorians that they reject is larger than the size of the class, right? So, I mean, they reject more high school valedictorians. If they admitted only valedictorians, they'd still be rejecting the majority of their valedictorians. So, in that kind of system, I don't even know what a merit system looks like.
No, I mean, there is a valid point there. And that goes to, one of the things that's hard to just fathom, I know that there's actually fewer, I don't know, now we're getting off topic maybe a little bit, but there are fewer applicants to colleges than there ever have been because the population of both individuals that age and their desire to go to college has waned in the last decade. But even accounting for that, because you just have so many people, you're absolutely true in the sense of what would it take to get in? I mean, even at smaller schools like what I work at, and like we have some Discord people on who we were swapping some of those stories this past week. I had all A's. Oh, well, you and everyone else I have looked at, for. And I think we forget that, and I'm taking to something else. Until you take a look at okay, here we go. I'm just going to do it. So Ken, have you ever taken a look at running or athletic times at the Olympics versus, say from 1930s, 1940s to what just people do at races today?
I've never looked, but I can see where you're going with that. I'm quite sure that everybody's much, much faster today than they were then.
So I am comparatively, I'm not a fast dude. I'm chronically ill. I have extra tubes in my butt, but I would have been in the top. I could have gone to the Olympics in the 1930s, even as I am right now. And today, to be in that kind of pace, you're talking about you're running 5-minute miles for 26.2 miles, right?
Yeah.
And it's not as if there weren't a lot of people who can do that. And so, I think your point there about, what does a merit system look like? And when you have really large ends as it goes through time, the people who will start hitting the peak of that curve, it increases and increases. It's crazy. But okay, we should leave that behind.
If I could say one more thing about that,
please.
I know I'm belaboring it, but you also talked about social mobility, and I think a lot of people think social mobility is a good role for universities to play, but it's entirely in contradiction with a true merit system, right? I mean, if you're going to let in people who are lesser prepared because they need it more, then you're not letting in the people who are better prepared than them, right? It's the opposite of a merit system.
No, that is true, and that can lead us to all kinds of issues talking about, what can you provide and what can you do in those circumstances. But I bet we should do. Maybe we could do another episode about that.
Yeah.
But I mean, time runs short, and I want to get at least one last story in, Ken, maybe two. We'll see what we got. But the one I want to make sure we get to is one that you were particularly kind of pointing me towards, and that was the ongoing developments between Russia and China. And I was happy to do this because, I don't know, we're the pair that often takes on international issues, especially as it deals potentially with U.S. foreign policy. And I think the relationship between Russia and China definitely falls into that category. And there has been some significant ink spilled over the relationship between Russia and China this past week. And that is because we have two major events have occurred. One, of course, happened last week, was covered by Mike and May, and that was the Wagner mercenary group's mutiny in Russia or uprising. I don't know. I have to think more carefully about that term. But then one of the new items to emerge this week that they weren't able to cover that links into that is that the key leader is not in exile, but is still in Russia, not in Belarus, despite the terms of his deal requiring him to be in Belarus. Now, the other item that happened, this kind of big event for this week, was the virtual meeting of the Shanghai Cooperation Organization Summit, which was held by India. The organization is a kind of a bit of a who's who of authoritarian regimes, with really the largest ideological oddball out being India, which is the only full democracy of the bunch. Now, although not our focus here, one of the big items out of that organization's meeting was Iran. Yeah, Iran was officially made a member. And at the next meeting, no surprise here, Belarus will become a member. Now, at the center of this group is the relationship between Russia and China, which has had attempted to be a counterweight to the Western and particularly American influence. Now, Putin would thank at the meeting other members for their support of Russian leadership during what he called, quote, pressure, sanctions, and provocations of the West. And he would also go on to point that out more specifically he's used a couple of different terms, but again, kind of the uprising or the mutiny or whatever that's going to be. Now, at the same time, the New York Times had a big analyst piece this past week postulating that there is a beginning of a rift between Russia and China, either is forming or could be forming. And the argument from them is pretty short, but it's easy to understand. It's that relationship is really more about individuals than it is about states. And that actually goes back to political science, right? Dictatorial regimes, authoritarian regimes are typically less institutionalized and have much more emphasis placed on the personification of particular individuals, in this case, Xi and Putin. So what if, as a result of the war in the Ukraine and now the uprising, it kind of maybe potentially puts Putin on less secure footing? And if that's the case, then does this change the relationship if China is made aware of the fragility of Russians' internal politics? Even if not, China might use these minor instabilities to extract more demands from Russia, which again could lead to bigger tensions between the two. And of course, their relationship between the two is going to be very important moving forward for the United States, both in terms of our relationship with China and for our relationship with Ukraine as it continues to fight Russia. Now, I'll kind of say quickly, I wasn't deeply convinced by the New York Times opinion that there's going to be a deep rift here. But I do think I think where they are spot on could be the idea that there might be a price to be paid by Russia to keep from being isolated via China. What do you take about all of this, Ken?
Yeah, so the article, the editorial or guest essay in the Times was by a guy named Ryan Haas, who was President Obama's advisor on China policy. So it's sort of a, Obama lens perspective, I guess, on this. But
well, they also had an analysis piece to go along with that one, by the way. And I had to look up the two editors who were the ones that wrote that, kind of to go along with it. So just a heads up, I was mentioning both of those in that story.
Oh,
Continue.
Great. Yeah, and you summarized them well. I think a couple other minor points, I guess, that Mr. Haas also made, which are interesting. When he was predicting that the rift is going to grow, he said that one of the reasons that China sort of tacitly supported the Russian invasion of Ukraine was that China believed that would kind of tie up the interest of the Western militaries, of the U.S. military, of the European militaries, and that would kind of give China a little bit more free hand for kind of a little bit of military adventurism in its part of Asia. And it has been getting militarily more aggressive in its part of Asia. And the thought was that, maybe China's thinking, well, America's not going to want to get involved in kind of underwriting wars in both Ukraine and in East Asia at the same time. So give us, we'll be able to do a little bit more and not have pushback. And so Mr. Haas was suggesting that was one of the motives that Xi Jinping had for supporting Putin in the Ukraine war. But he said that that's kind of unraveling now, because not only have all the Western militaries kind of, gone pretty far in on supporting Ukraine, but actually it's led to a lot more troops from the West being sent to that part of the world, including on the Chinese border, which is kind of the opposite of what he wanted. And so I thought that was interesting. And also that to the extent that maybe one thing that was animating long-term Chinese planning was that they eventually want to try to take Taiwan. The idea of seeing what Russia did was kind of a proxy for that, right? They're looking at Ukraine, they're saying, well, that used to be part of Russia and that really should be part of Russia, and we're going to take it back. And the real difficulty that they've had, and they may, everybody thought they would eventually succeed, but I think now people are thinking they won't eventually succeed. It's not good for China if one of their main objectives was to do a similar kind of military action to take Taiwan. And so I think those are all real factors. On the other hand, I think I'm just exactly where you are here. Despite that, and I sense that, when you were saying that these articles may be exaggerating the rift, that may be true, because I think China and Russia still have this shared interest in, basically not being, being stronger than America, basically, and they're stronger than America together than they would be separate and apart. And if you look back to the 1970s, when there was the Sino-Soviet split, that basically did weaken both those countries, and strengthen America. And so I think they have a lot of incentive to try to stay aligned as kind of the authoritarian regimes who are counterweights to America in the geopolitical system, and that they both can recognize that they have more ability to do that if they stick together. So I think I took that to be what you were sort of saying also. Yeah, I think I'm on the same page as you there.
Yeah, I think the thing that could potentially, I think the probability of a rift hinges on, and again, maybe that's what we're seeing here with, again, I think it's a big deal that Putin has a rival who is not yet leaving Russia and is also not afraid for his life yet. But I think the possibility would be if there's a bigger push on Putin's power in a larger way, and China used that in the way that we see here in these analysts arguing that they might, and that's a possibility to try to get especially oil flowing away from Europe and largely to China, leading some of those pipelines. In other words, maybe putting the screws on Putin a little bit if they see some weakness there. I think the thing that would potentially cause a split is if, in response to that, Putin lashed it out, right? So as he's kind of going down, if China puts too many screws on, and so then Russia, Putin specifically, then trying to pushes back as a way to potentially supporting himself, that can lead you to a rift. But yeah, I agree. And you're reading me rightly to say that I don't see that splitting right now because I don't think you have as much instability as they're postulating there for Putin, at least not to a level that I think is going to change international policy yet. And they're going to have to overcome the history, as you have rightfully mentioned, of the fact that the last time they split, it wasn't good for either partner in their bid to want to be what you might call the anti-West or the West alternative, to maybe make it less negative.
Right, and it actually was the kind of the beginning of the end for the Soviet Union, really.
Yeah. Which, I mean, surely Putin doesn't, although, I mean, there you go. I mean, Putin, it would be ironic if Putin went down under similar circumstances to the Soviet Union, wouldn't it? Yeah. I'm not predicting that, but it would be a bit of a poetic justice, I guess. But I mean, I think the other thing, and this is, kind of an extent beyond that, but I've thought about this in terms of the instability. One of the big concerns during my lifetime when you had the fall of the Soviet Union, I mean, of course, that's a positive thing in some ways, but there are a lot of really dangerous nuclear weapons. and what happens with that if you had those kinds of instability or relationship breakdowns?
Yeah, I mean, I don't know that it could get much worse than it already has, but maybe it could.
Yeah. Well, I mean, I can imagine it being a little bit worse, Ken, in the sense of you have an individual. I mean, it's hard to imagine somebody, you'd say, well, terrible individual, and he is, and I'm in no way supporting him or him holding and maintaining power. But individuals like Putin who are backed into corners will not hesitate to do terrible, terrible things. And if they happen to have the ability to make part of that terrible thing a nuclear device, Well,
I agree. I mean, I think he might use one now, and I also think we don't actually know that he has all the nuclear weapons that were the legacy of the Soviet Union. Other people could have some of those as well. So it's So I think we're already in a pretty bad situation as far as really knowing what happened with all the nuclear weapons the Soviets had, and or having faith that they're in the hands of people who wouldn't use them.
Yeah, I mean, Yeah. Well, again, I guess we should probably stop there and end this week's show. But you don't get to get away from me because here in just a few minutes, we're going to be recording our bonus show. So I'm really excited for our midweek show to be coming out. And then we're on again 2 more weeks, right? This is the first of 3 for the 2 of us.
Yeah, that's awesome.
So if you would like to become a supporter of the Politics Guys, we would really like to have you because without our supporters, that's what keeps the podcast going. Now, that all sounds good and you might do it for some, feel good reason. I'm happy if you want to do that. But you also get a lot of cool stuff if you become a supporter. And one of the big items is ad-free versions of everything that we do, as well as that supporters exclusive midweek show that I was just mentioning. Now, Ken and I, we have been going through the Constitution and, generally you're just kind of getting about 1 or 2 a month. But this week, we're going to be going through the Constitution for 3 weeks in a row. And we'd really love for you to join in. We're going to be starting on Article 3 of the Constitution and moving forward. All of the other episodes are there. So if you become a supporter, you can go back and you can start with our introduction to the Constitution as we go through Articles 1 and 2. It's all there. And it's just a chance to kind of not do the news thing, but really kind of take a look at something that has a longer bit of shelf life. And we'd love for you to be a part of that. And to be a part of that, you're going to have to become a supporter. Now, how can you become a supporter of the Politics Guys? Well, to check it out, head to patreon.com/politics guys. Now, when you get there, you're going to see all these different levels, the different things you get. So at one level, you can become part of our Discord group. At another, you're going to get the ad-free version of things. But again, take a look at all of that there at patreon.com/politics guys. You can see all those levels of support. Click on the level of support you want and the things that you'd like. And you can do that. As a matter of fact, you can even, if you want to, become an executive producer of the Politics Guys. But take a look at that on patreon.com/politics guys. Now, if you'd like to support us other ways, we're also on Venmo, where we're at Politics Guys. You can also support the show through PayPal. All of those options are in the show notes, or if you'd like to do it in a browser, you can head to politicsguys.com/support. Again, that's politicsguys.com/support, and you can support us through any of our channels. Now, if you'd like to get that midweek show, you want to do more in the Constitution, but you're just not in a position financially to support the podcast right now, I totally get that. And we can fix that up for you. All you have to do is send an email to mike@politicsguys.com, and he's going to get you set up on our list, and you'll be getting an email from me or from him, and you'll be able to download your episode there. Whether you're a supporter or not, we would really appreciate it if you would subscribe, rate, and review us on whatever podcast app you use, and share that episode on social media. If you've got a question, comment, gripe, question, or just anything else you'd like to share, you can reach us at mail@politicsguys.com. We're also on Facebook and Twitter, and you're going to find the notes for all of these right down there. You guessed it, in the show notes. The executive producers of the Politics Guys are Bruce Johnson, Wilma Marino, Andra Masker, Daniel Toe, Ryan Beasley, Don Oglesby, and Ivan English. We'll be back with a new episode next week. I hope you'll join us then.